I think it was really interesting if we look at the comment that came in from Lana, that yes, the automated side of things that Gen AI can do, but actually all of us here today as teachers have a future, certainly a view I share. But I also think it's quite interesting, perhaps if we as a panel can reflect on the experience that we had as learners of other languages and how successful or not our learning and our teachers were. So if I kick off, when I was learning French at school, I think I was perhaps a little bit luckier than most because my French teacher did attend to two sounds in French that differed significantly from English. That was the distinction between vous et tu. And he actually used his little finger to make the point tu and vous, and and showed the mouth. He also tried, but didn't really have the language or the mouth shape knowledge to be able to make the difference between those French nasals. So basically, a lot of it, the teacher would say something, I would say envoyer. He'd say, no, 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 envoyer. And I was like, what's the difference? How does that correspond to your experiences as learners of English, Anna, Steve, Lana? And were there any things that your teachers didn't do that looking back you wish they had done?
I think they barely taught pronunciation when I was at school. So I'm 51. I did French as well and Latin. And my biggest memory of learning languages was rote learning vocabulary and not even chunks. So individual words. There was very little focus on pronunciation. And if we did do any pronunciation, it was literally just the teacher would repeat the same thing multiple times, perhaps slightly louder each time, in the vain hope that we would be able to replicate it. But there wasn't, I didn't find out anything about pronunciation until I came to teaching it myself. I hadn't even thought about the position of the lips, the tongue, the mouth, nothing. That definitely didn't come. And I studied French at university as well. And I remember also having zero help with the pronunciation for 4 years at university. So I learnt by going to France, listening and imitating, not
So I
in the
guess
classroom.
we've got two things coming out here in the classroom. We've got the mechanical stuff that as teachers we can do to show our learners how to go about pronouncing any given language, plus then the value of exposure. So Steve, can we come to you and I'll send a message to Lana about her.
Yes, I think she's on mute. Yes, a couple of things to say. As a schoolboy in about 1960, about 1960, I did French at school, and the French teacher just screamed corrections at us, whether they were about pronunciation or anything else. So that was why I never spoke French very well. At home, we had German, Yiddish, and Hungarian hanging around the house. So I did much better in that respect, not so much with Hungarian because it was only my father and granny who spoke Hungarian together. So I didn't really have a great kind of insight into it. But I just wanted to say, come back to you, Neil, on something else, talking about really why pronunciation is in the mess that it's in, pronunciation teaching. I gave a lecture in 2004 about the history of pronunciation teaching. And to do that, I did a lot of research into course books of the period and earlier too. And I looked at the way that pronunciation was dealt with in course books, which of course is very influential. Most teachers would use course books, and it was dismal, absolutely dismal. And there's very, very little. I've still got the text of that lecture if anybody wants it. But it looks at all the major and some of the minor course books, and they let teachers down dramatically. Even something as good as CoBuild, for example, which I think was a shining light in its time as a lexical, real world language model, if you want. They hardly dealt with pronunciation, so it's not surprising to me that we are where we are. And okay, yeah, for now that's enough, I think.
An interesting one. Perhaps we can come back to that point about the role of course books. But Lana, back to you and your experience of the many languages that you speak.
Well, I can start with English, and I could say that I was very much, I mean, I was lucky because I got this classical linguist education, linguist training. But there was one thing, we had only one model. That was the standard RP model. And then I started studying Swedish and other languages, and then I understood one thing, that there is always this risk when you're exposed only to one model. Always a risk connected with understanding. And I think the more models we're exposed to, the better. It's not just about accent training. I mean, we are talking about pronunciation. So the more models we are exposed to, the better pronunciation will be, listening, comprehension, understanding in general. So to say, speak locally, hear globally, right?
Nice point. I mean, it's always, and I don't know if we have anyone in the audience who can help with this, but what's always interested me, because I've had the honor of working with a lot of teachers from Moscow State University, and they all have incredibly intelligible, in very clear Russian inflected RP. And I that maybe speaks to what you've just said, Lana, about the lack of the range of models. And perhaps what we see with bringing it back to course books, with books like Voices, where we're increasingly getting global accents of English coming in as models, that students can have that greater tolerance, both in terms of ear tolerance, but also an intercultural tolerance to English being spoken as a global language rather than there's this tiny little RP language where, we know that, that inner circle is such a small proportion of the global speakers of English. Steve, can you perhaps go back? Perhaps can we all just think a little bit about course books? You've done this kind of through time, Steve. Do you see things improving?
I don't, and actually, I'm not up to date with course books. I think the latest stuff I've got is the complete series of Q, because I did something for OUP. But I note that Philip, who is currently teaching, says that course books just include a minor section on prawn at the end, and I think that certainly was the case. I don't think things have improved. My research took me back, well, it took me further than the early 20th century, but during the early 20th century, 1921, Palmer was talking about exercises for articulatory exercises. So in a sense, I could argue that we're still there. The problem is that listen and repeat is terribly seductive. You think, if you don't know any better, you think that you can say something and someone will try to copy it. But of course, it doesn't work like that. And I do think that most coursebook authors don't know how to do it. I don't think they know how to do it. And publishers are to blame as well. And that's largely the reason why it was abandoned. I called it the second fiddle to the great orchestra of syntax and structure. So I don't think things have improved at all. I think there are still teachers around. Well, I know there are. I've seen them myself in classrooms in China and in South America. Teachers are still doing listen and repeat. And if I might just weave that into the next, if I can, just two quick points. One is that we mustn't lose sight of what the student wants. We are very good as teachers at making decisions for students without considering them. We're talking about intelligibility. I, as a language learner, don't want to be intelligible. I really don't. I want to be much more than that. Right. So we've got to be very, very careful not to make decisions for students. And the second point that I want to make, and then I'll shut up, is about the psychology of pronunciation. I don't think that AI can deal with it, and I don't think it ever will. I don't think AI will ever manage to deal effectively with ego permeability or tolerance of ambiguity and affectivity and all those things. Risk-taking is part of pronunciation, isn't it? In order to sound as good as you want to sound, whatever that, in my case, I like to sound like a native speaker. in order to do that, you've got to take risks. And I don't think AI is going to help you do that. I think what you need to help you do that is a competent and skilled teacher.
Might slightly disagree with your point about, but I'll come back to that because Lana, what's your view first?
Uh, well, I wrote in the chat box this idea that AI, the objective of AI is actually to automate processes, not to mimic communication or anything else. That's automation of processes that can be automated. So in terms of teaching globally or teaching pronunciation in particular, whichever aspect can be automated, can be supplemented with AI, but there are aspects that simply cannot be automated. So no AI will be of help there. And I don't think that anyone would be able to turn them into patterns. That's the thing. So I do agree with Steve. There are certain areas that cannot be tackled with the help of AI. Because that's a simple question of automation, whether we can put it into a database or not, whether we could pick out patterns in that or not. But humans are a pretty sensitive matter, I would say. Not everything can be so easily put into databases.
I was watching television last night, and there is a British Gas advert out here in the UK at the moment where I mean, it's obviously not real filming, but you get a picture of a gas engineer who's fiddling with something that's broken. And because British Gas now in the UK doesn't just deal with gas, but it deals with fridges as well, um, there's this interaction between a football player from Liverpool who is thanking the gas man for the fact that he's mended the fridge. And he turns around and says, "Oh, it's great. It just works." Now, that's a terrible Liverpudlian accent. My apologies. But the point is, isn't it? The sound substituted for a diphthong in Liverpudlian, and that pattern is not going to be nearly visible enough in terms of that automation for it to become visible unless someone decides to create a chatbot for Liverpudlian English, which, arguably were a really nice thing to do. Just coming back to that point about course books, I know Gabby has a point to make here. Gabby, because we do like our participants to come along, Gabby, what's your thought about course books and perhaps how they're beginning to be a little bit more nuanced in terms of their ability to deal with pronunciation? Hi.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah. Oh dear, you just you put me on the spot now. Um, Look, I mean, well, in terms of course books, really, I haven't used course books for about 10 years. So, I mean, let's be realistic. So I don't know how much has actually changed. But to be honest, I don't really expect much to change in terms of course books and pronunciation teaching. I don't think it's actually possible. So I don't know if you agree with me, but there's very, very little we can do in terms of changing how we can teach pronunciation when using course books. I mean, that's my personal opinion, but I may be wrong.
The reason I was perhaps wondering, and again, anyone else in the audience who would like to chip in here, is that, and I'm trying to find the date of its publication. I've got a feeling it was the early 2010s. OUP published a series called Navigate, and it was one of the first attempts for a course book to actually look at pronunciation, and it's important for listening as well as for speaking. And this, I think, was coming from work by people like Richard Cordwell, who has been really influential in terms of creating. He's got a whole book on it called A Syllabus for Listening, Decoding. What he's trying to do is train people to realize, and that's where my example of would you like a cup of tea through to would you like a cup of tea through to we like cup tea. And he has this idea of the garden the greenhouse, I think it is, and then the jungle, and the complexity of the ordered sounds in your garden with nicely organized plants or nicely organized sounds with rapid speech, through to the jungle where you can't really work out where things start and finish. Can you hear the word boundaries in "we like a cup of tea"? Now, of course, that's only one aspect of pronunciation. We're really focusing, I think, more on its productive side of things. There's quite a lot in chat about exposure. Steve.
I just thought about context there for a moment. So if I come into your house and you say, "Fancy a cup of tea," I'll have a pretty good idea of what you're talking about. But if we're standing at a bus stop,
Yes,
then the situation is different. So I think that's also a part of the deal, isn't it? If we're talking about decoding, part of the decoding process relies on context, and that's why I think that in classrooms we're kind of up against it in a way. And so we need to be creating situations. We need to be creating contexts in which language can occur.
I think it was Stanovich who looked at this kind of interactive model whereby, context, the top down takes over at the point where the bottom up fails. So if you don't understand "we like a cup of tea," but you're in your kitchen and someone's got a kettle in their hand and then tea bag in the other, then, all starts to make sense. And that does also raise an issue, doesn't it, about how we teach and how we deal with pronunciation for production as well as for listening in the classroom. Because unless we've got loads of realia, we may not have that kettle and that tea bag. But likewise, classrooms tend to be pretty inauthentic arenas. We often play, less so than we used to, audio streams rather than video streams, and therefore the context is somewhat lost. Does this discussion that we've had so far help us to start draw some conclusions about what we're looking for when it comes to good pronunciation, teaching and learning, where the teacher is not in control? Because as you said, Steve, we need to listen to the learner and what do they want, but where the teacher has a role to play. I know you've got some strong views about things we can bring into the classroom to
I
help.
think it's just interesting what you've just said there, and it goes back to what Steve said. At the end of the day, the student or the learner is the customer. So it's what is their need. So it's really interesting that we're talking about this AI and all these things, and you've just said that we still have audio streams, and you're quite right. So I've just done a whole load of IELTS listenings this week. And you're thinking, well, actually, yeah, it would be great. What if they showed a video? Because how often in the university, yes, the person might be nowadays, if you're talking to a professor at uni, you're probably on a webinar, you've probably got the camera, and like we are sitting now, you're having a conversation. Very few conversations, I think, between a university professor and somebody is going to be on a telephone. So actually having the visual cues are really important. And also going back to Steve's point, I think there's the emotional side as well, can't we? We can help, if we see our listener is struggling, we can make our pronunciation a bit slower, a bit clearer. We can use the context, we can use our hands. I don't think AI can ever do this. And as Svetlana said, I think what we are so fortunate that there are so many amazing tools, and AI is one of them, and it will get better and it will catch up with them. But there's no substitute for all the awareness raising you can do yourself, the more you know about pronunciation. So I think going back to what you were saying, Neil, also about how you were making the French sounds, touching your face, your mouth, looking at all those places of where sounds come from and how they come together, and creating an amazing culture for learning where people feel confident to risk having a go, and not feeling scared if they get it wrong, and also making people understand, actually, I don't think RP is something to aspire to anymore. I think for the vast majority of people, that's not what they need or want. So I think it's helping students have a realistic expectation and choosing every tool, whether that's a physical, bring it back to basics, get your mirror or get your phone, turn the camera back on yourself, look at your face, or whether it's using an AI tool to support. I think all of those things are equally valid.
So to bring it back to basics, I know you love teaching pronunciation and you've taught me lots about teaching pronunciation yourself. Imagine that you're leaving the house and you know you've got a group of students and you're going to help them with pronunciation. What do you have in your teacher's kit bag that is going to help you to help those learners, assuming that you already know what it is that they want? And let's say that they want to be intelligible plus.
For me personally, I think a lot of it is about recognition comes before production. So first of all, just understand what you're listening to before you're aspiring to produce something similar. Students need to understand word boundaries, don't they? They need to listen out for key. I think they need to be tolerant of ambiguity. People need to accept that it's not a great aspirational goal to go for 100% understanding of anything.
Mhm.
So I think being brave to not understand and not get everything is a really important step. And I think you need to physically relax as a person and as a learner to get your best self and your best ability of what you. So it's not necessarily that there's a particular tool, I would say, because I think every learner has a different need. So, you know, Steve and I are both great fans of questionnaire rods. Questionnaire rods can be fantastic for helping students see shifting stress. Absolutely brilliant. But I'm not going to get a rod out of my bag every time I have a learn. You know, it would depend what they want and what they need. And there are fantastic books, resources. I'm sure, I don't know, Lana and Steve, what kind of things do you use as a practical tool?
Lana, go ahead.
That's like lots of tools. I mean, I can't think of any like one single tool that I use. Lots of things depending on a particular student and their particular needs. But as a general tool, I think Neil gave the addressing in the chat box that was Youglish. I love Youglish because that's the exposure to all possible accents, Australian, British English, American English, and students can be exposed and they can pick the pronunciation that they need. Because again, not everyone needs, I mean, whenever we say there is a particular model, I think that there is one risk that students get too much worried about trying to match their accent, some particular model. And there comes this nervousness. And then teachers themselves often feel worried that they are not matching that ideal model.
And you know, I think it is worth unpicking there. But before we do, Georgi has asked in chat, and I think Lana, you've just answered his question for him. Georgi's question was, is there a way to get different pronunciations for the same text for exposure to a variety of accents? Youglish is great, isn't it? Because, well, can you tell us about Youglish?
Well, English just gives you patterns, gives you particular words. I mean, it's not about reproducing or producing a text in different accents. So it will just give you different words used in various YouTube videos.
Right.
So that's just for checking whether the word is all right or whether the pronunciation is correct. But if you have a text and you would like to have to expose your students to various models like American English or British English, some Southern version, etc. You can use some text-to-speech model like 11 Labs, but there is one but. I wouldn't use text-to-speech. I would use a speech-to-speech model, and then that will be a hit. A speech-to-speech is the model that changes your speech and uses the accent of some speaker in the database. But you kind of control the process. Because if you just make a recording of text-to-speech models, then you will see that what you get, the generated output, is not really good. It will be blunt, it will be monotonous, and it will have all the features of this robotic language that we're not happy with. But speech-to-speech is a different matter.
So we've got 11 labs, but we also have natural readers, which and I know we've got other people, hi Ros, who work a lot in the healthcare space. And many of them are preparing for an international exam where they are going to have exposure to at least American, Australian, and British accents. I'm waiting for the day where they have exposure to Italian, French, Spanish, South American accents as well, because let's face it, patients aren't all native speakers round over. But one of the advantages, at least for those exams, is that you can start to sensitize yourself to approximations of British, American, Australian accents using these admittedly sometimes quite robotic AI voices through 11labs.io and naturalreaders.com, I think it is. I'll check that. Can I come back to this point about exposure? Because a lot of people are talking about the fact that actually, and Anna, you were the first person to mention this, it was when you actually moved abroad that you felt that that was actually the turning point for you being able to become closer to a kind of model. Now, like you, like everyone in the panel, I'm a language learner as well as a language teacher, and I'm a complete hypocrite. When I teach English, I encourage people to be open to different accents, to having a Spaniard having a Spanish accent, or an Italian having an Italian accent. But when I'm learning Italian, veramente non mi piace un accento britannico così, perché giustamente io voglio un accento veramente italiano. So I want to sound native like in my foreign languages, which is a bit hypocritical. So many people don't have the opportunity of exposure. So is there anything that we can do to make up for the fact that going to live in a foreign country is very expensive with, geopolitical systems as they are? People might actually not want to travel to certain countries anymore. Can we as teachers do anything to help our learners? Can AI or media help with that? What does anyone think?
I feel like Steve has a thought about this. He was.
Well, I was just thinking that it's not hypocritical. That's really that's why I was shaking my head. I mean, you and I share that desire to sound like a native speaker, and I'm taken for a native speaker, which sometimes can be a disadvantage because people throw stuff at me that might be beyond me. I just a quick supporting the notion that we need to listen to what students want. I once had a French business gentleman. It was in mid-50s, I think, so quite young. And we did a needs analysis at the start of his one-to-one course, and I said to him, we got to pronunciation. I said, what would you like me to do with pronunciation? Where do you want to go with your pronunciation? And he said to me, don't even think about it. It is part of my soul. He wouldn't let me touch his pronunciation. He didn't want to do any pronunciation. And, what do you do with that? You have to respect it. In fact, I found tricks to get round that so that he did, in fact, work on pronunciation because he wasn't intelligible. And that's my bottom line, really. If it's not intelligible, then something has to be done.
So we're beginning to build up a kind of a bit of an inventory, I think. We recognize accent variation good, intelligibility critical baseline, asking the learner what they want and why they want it, and respecting it unless intelligibility is somehow compromised by that.
And also, if I might just feed into that line there, letting them know that they're almost certainly not going to reach native speaker competence. This is the reality. And I don't think teachers are sometimes not honest enough with learners about that, especially adult learners, as you pointed out.
Before the webinar started, and some people actually were in the room with us, we were having a conversation. It goes back to your point about ego permeability and speech accommodation theory. Can you just tease that out a bit so that people perhaps are less familiar with these ideas can understand why some people are able or more able, why some people are less able to approach a native-like accent, particularly as adults?
I think it's pretty difficult to tease that out. But I think it really all comes down to risk taking. If you look at ego permeability and tolerance of ambiguity, they're on a spectrum of risk taking. And I think the more able you are to, if you as a beginner in a language, as a low-level learner, you go into a shop and you want to buy something. And in order to do that, you have to expose yourself, don't you? Even as a mid-level learner, actually, possibly even later on too. So you have to expose yourself, and you become, in a sense, you take on a sort of childlike status, don't you? What you're talking like a 4-year-old or a 6-year-old or whatever it is. I love that example that I think I probably invented, which is somebody going into a shop and saying, please, hello, please, I like, please, perhaps this thing, what you put, make rain stop, please, can you help me? And the guy says, of course, I've got an umbrella. Here you are. There it is. That's £59.60 or whatever. So I think the risk that person took in going into the shop and putting those things together, using strategic competence as well, using the words that he had and some mime and all of it, plus context, because it's pissing with rain outside, right? So I think it really comes down to risk taking. So the question I would ask myself, to go back to your question, Neil, about what tools you take into class, the question I ask myself, or the tool I want to take into class, is how can I get students to take risks comfortably?
Mm-hmm.
That's where I am.
I think, Steve, it's fascinating now that actually, despite the fact that we've got exposure to all these models, it's actually easier and easier for students not to take risks, because your example of going in and buying an umbrella, you can, of course, now people order everything online. Sometimes it's really quite hard to find those opportunities. You go to the supermarket, you pay automatically, you see everything. So we've massively reduced the need for people to put themselves out there. And so it takes a real special kind of learner now. And I've had a student this year this week from Japan who's been desperately trying to find opportunities to speak and sort of accosting people walking down the beach or at the bus stop, and they actually think it's weird. And I sort of said, well, maybe you're going to have to look a little bit at small talk first of all. Don't just immediately accost them, but maybe mention about the weather. So perhaps that's always a good starting point so that they trust you. But I think it's ironic that we've got all these tools out there, but some of those tools actually disenfranchise somebody from having an opportunity to put themselves out there and try something. So yeah, really interesting.
Absolutely. I remember being in Denmark and I went into a supermarket. I was living in Denmark. I'd just arrived, really, and I was intent on learning the language. And so I was in the supermarket and I was counting and I was speaking to the girl behind the till, and she answered me in perfect English. So I never had a chance to learn the laryngitis of Danish.
Conscious, we have about 5 minutes remaining, and we've talked a lot about the fact that in spite of all of the media hype, we as teachers, we don't think are going to disappear anytime soon. And let's raise our glasses to that. But let's look to the future. If I may, and perhaps start with Lana, to think about our crystal ball. The thing about AI, and that's the difficulty, isn't it? That the speed of the improvement is exponential. All the predictions 3 years ago of where AI would be a year later happened within 6 months and so on. But Lana, have you any kind of suggestions about where AI might be taking us in terms of pronunciation production or listening for decoding? And do you think there is a hard stop where we're not going to go any further?
Well, I think this technology will be developing, but in essence, I don't have a crystal ball. But I think that it's a personal choice. So some people resort to Google Translate and they go abroad and they use Google Translate and they don't bother learning any language or any single phrase because they rely heavily on this Google Translate and they're happy. No judgment here. So, but there will be people who will be learning languages for the sake of learning languages, but of course, these tools that will be a huge thing to support. At the same time, as for replacement, that's mass market and quality. In terms of high quality, no tool will be enough, will be sufficient enough to replace it all. But if people would like to use Google Translate, they will be using Google Translate. So as for development, whether languages, because I see these debates online about languages going extinct and learners will stop learning languages. I don't believe that will happen. Languages make us human, but of course there will be people who will solely rely on tools, on technology.
I mean, the really good news coming out of the UK, I was lucky enough to be part of a discussion group about the development of the new international education strategy for the UK. And a lot of that actually was talking about soft power, the fact that languages enable cultural exchange, negotiation, peace amongst nations. And I really don't think Google Translate's ever going to be able to do that. I was in Thailand a couple of weeks ago. I was there for a couple of months ago. I was there for 3 days. So I was happy to just get by with Swadee Kwa, Swadee Krupp. But actually, when I got lost and I was in a taxi, it was quite nice to have Google Translate. So I could have a chat with the taxi driver and create a kind of rapport because we had no other way of doing it than Google Translate. Thus, I knew that it was second best. So maybe also we need to be talking to our learners in L1 and L2 about the differences of that connection that we make between people through a mobile phone and then face to face. Anna, Steve, bouncing back to the two of you. Again, I don't think any of us have a crystal ball. Any comments, any thoughts, or maybe any fears for the future in terms of pronunciation?
Go ahead, Steve.
In terms of pronunciation, all right, I was going to go into a whole world crisis scenario. I remember that when in the, what was it, the late 50s, I think they started producing TV dinners and convenience food and all that stuff in the UK. And people were saying, oh, that's the end of fine dining and chefs will go out of business and all those doomsayers. This is the same thing, really. I don't think there'll always be people like us who love to learn languages, who love to play with languages, love to play with sounds, and I think that will always be the case. And I don't think I'm no expert on AI, as I've said, but I don't think AI will ever manage to get the nuance that we, with our skills and observatory powers and our empathy. That's an important word for if we're talking about risk taking. It'll never do that. It'll never reach that.
I totally agree with you, Steve. And interestingly, empathy was a word I wrote on my board today for a Korean student when we were looking at the nuance between I regret to tell you and I regret telling you. And she was deciding that you don't need to ever regret to tell somebody something because you can just be direct. You don't need that empathy. Which was really another whole interesting thing. But I would agree with you, Steve, as well. And I think it's very much everything goes full circle. Vintage is fashionable, isn't it? So, our older ways of doing things will become fashionable. I think one thing that maybe is slightly less positive is that I don't think our older ways are massively effective. We still need a bigger toolkit and we need more people, more instructors to be confident to teach pronunciation and not just do that tiny little segment in the course book, which in my humble opinion, I think actually is often put there for people that are scared of using their own models or perhaps don't feel confident that their model is good enough. And that might come down to sort of the history of ELT and where we were going for that RP model. And it was perceived that everybody that didn't have that needed an RP model on tape at the time. To produce something that was, valuable enough for a learner to listen to. It's no longer the case, but I think there's more work to do with us, with our soft skills than there is with AI, possibly.